Hi there, my name is Matt Hayashi. I am the CEO of Cannabis Clearwater, and I am happy to and honored to interview Yarrow. Um, Yarrow is an expert on social equity, and I am so gracious to be in his presence. So, hello, Yarrow. How are you?
Matt, thanks so much for having me on. I really appreciate the opportunity to sort of amplify the issues that are important to me and tell a little bit about my story.
Yeah, so I think this is a great opportunity for everybody. So, why don't you give yourself a quick introduction of what you've done in the cannabis space, and let's talk about that social equity programs that you talk about.
Sure. So, I'm a second generation cannabis cultivator, born in San Francisco, raised in the Emerald Triangle, earned my first dollar in cannabis 35 years ago, trimming for my mom's farm. And so I have legacy, medical, and adult use of regulated experience. Um, And as a consultant, I have a small sole prop consultancy called Special Teams Consulting, where I've typically been a business tool. Um, and all of my clients have been referrals through cannabis attorneys and cannabis CPAs. And what I specialize on
Okay.
is sort of stress testing ideas and making sure that they conform with the regulations, as well as they're not overly optimistic around sort of the cannabis ecosystem. But what I'm going to focus on is cannabis real estate, and so the underpinnings, the infrastructure related to the permit, the real property in addition to the permit, and helping people to job cost and estimate what it'll take to build out a facility. And I help companies acquire and divest cannabis assets. And so I had been hired by the Legion of Bloom to help them to source qualified social equity applicants in Oakland for a cultivation facility that they were working on.
Okay.
And I didn't really understand what social equity applicants were for cannabis. And the reason why they call it Special Teams Consulting is it's a play and the ball's bouncing and we got to run down the field and figure out how we're going to work on it. And so that's my football reference. And so I did a deep dive and I tried to figure out where there'd be some qualified social equity applicants in Oakland for this cultivation brand. And I sourced 3 or 4 of them. And so it sort of put that on my radar. And then San Francisco came out with a social equity cannabis criteria. And I started reading it and I started like laughing and crying at the same time.
Hmm.
I was laughing and crying because it brought to the front all of my experiences and that very painful path through legacy and medical and into regulated cannabis for myself. But I was also laughing because I was like, hey, that's me. Went to the wrong schools, grew up in the wrong neighborhoods, and got in the right trouble. And so I decided I was going to do social equity the way I do everything, right? Both
Right.
feet in, totally up to my eyeballs.
Right.
And so on a policy side, as soon as California Cannabis Industry Association had a social equity committee, I was on it. And I've been on it, I think, 4 out of the last 5 years. Later, the National Cannabis Industry Association had a social equity, what we call diversity, inclusion, and social equity committee. I was on it as soon as it existed. First year, I was the community organizer. Second year, I was the vice chair. And I'm just kind of all in. And what I've watched, and I've tried to network with other verified social equity applicants in San Francisco also, because we were all sort of trying to compare best practices and how do we leverage the opportunity and how do we not get taken advantage of and how do we avoid predatory terms and things like that. And as soon as these programs were in place, I started looking at social equity in Los Angeles and social equity in Long Beach and other areas, pockets of California that had a social equity program. Recently, I've been invited to join the board of CWA, which is Social Equity Workers Alliance down in Southern California. And I've just paid attention as these social equity programs have also sprung up in new markets, such as New York. And so it just seems like it's as varied as those programs are. It seems like the best chance for society, aside from releasing anybody who's in prison for cannabis and expunging any and all cannabis related offenses, aside from that, It seems like it's the best attempt by society to acknowledge that the failed policy that was cannabis prohibition disproportionately impacted communities of color and communities of poverty. And now I'm trying in the social equity conversation to make sure that we are looking at social equity through the lens of social equity on a very regional basis. And so it's easy, I think, for some people to understand social equity in an urban definition than it is in an agrarian definition. And so in a lot of the urban areas, if you qualify for a social equity program, you might have to come from what's called a disproportionately impacted area, an area where they could show that the crime and the enforcement statistics clearly prioritized cannabis prohibition in those geographies, zip codes, regions. But what's really challenging is an agrarian definition of social equity to complement that urban definition. And in areas like, Humboldt or Mendocino, it's not enough to have lived in those areas or to be
Right.
in those areas, even
Right.
though they received the brunt of the enforcement, at least from the cultivator's perspective. People are having to document that they were involved in either enforcement actions or interactions with the police related to cannabis. And it's honestly a perfect example of where these policies have a lot of room for improvement, because I think one could reasonably argue that the entire Humboldt area was disproportionately impacted, and that somebody shouldn't have to show a receipt from a camp raid or a sheriff department interaction just to
Right.
qualify as social equity. And unfortunately, that's what they're doing, is they're keeping this very high bar up there in a way that is, I'd rather see these programs more inclusive than exclusive. And so luckily now, at least there's money available on a state level to provide grant funding for the regions that have social equity programs. And that grant funding gets divided as both direct grants to social equity recipients, as well as operational guidance and technical assistance to third parties such as NGOs or 1003Cs. And
Now,
so I think that this year we'll see a lot more growth in those
right.
programs.
Now, just to clarify some things, I know people will have some questions. Social equity, by definition, what is the definition of social equity for people who do not know what that actually means?
Well, I mean, I think that everybody's going to have a slightly different definition. I mean, that's not to sidestep the answer, but I think that everybody will have hopefully either deeply personal, or they'll be willing to listen to other people who have been impacted and adopt those people's definition of social equity. To me, and I can only speak for me with all the policy and committee work I've done, I speak for no organization, just me.
Yep.
To me, social equity is this notion that there have been generations of harm inflicted upon communities as a result of the inherently racist policy, which was cannabis prohibition. And we know from the genesis of those laws and the enforcement of those laws and the disproportionate sentencing that the war on drugs was a war on communities of poverty and communities of color. We could digress away from cannabis and look at the difference of sentencing with cocaine, if it was powdered versus rock, to see that these policies were very unfair and typically were born across the backs of communities of brown and black people. And so to me, social equity is this acknowledgement within cannabis policy that now that there's a regulated industry, we need to make room for those marginalized communities that were most impacted before there was a regulated industry, and ideally provide some advantage, some head start, some propping up. I mean, you can't look at a single industry in this country and not see the typically positive impacts of government cooperation with industry. And so here we are with the fledgling beginning of a regulated industry. We're still in, the second quarter. And the idea is, how do we prioritize the communities and people and families that have already gone through the ringer, whether it was asset forfeiture, whether it was fathers, uncles, mothers convicted of felonies and the way of cannabis felonies and the way in which that affected their ability to rent homes, their ability to purchase homes, their ability to get jobs, or broken families because children were going to visit their parents and looking through a glass window to talk to them
Right.
at a Sunday visit in jail. I mean, the amount of impacts from cannabis prohibition on certain communities is just not the word. And so it's no, to me, it's no longer an opinion. It's just stats. It's public policy stats. And so social equity, I think, acknowledges that those harms were not evenly amortized across all of society. And as such, there should be preference and priority given to people who are constituents of those pockets of society that were really, really impacted by prohibition.
Now, is it fair to say if I'm starting into the cannabis industry and let's say I want to start a nursery and I have low income, um, the land that I have is below the value and all this stuff. Is it fair to say that I would qualify for some of this social equity status where if I did get approved, all of my fees for application, my application fees be waived? Is that kind of like the general consensus of what this whole program is all about?
Well, let me unpack that through a variety of buckets or lenses. The
Yeah,
first is primarily social equity as for cannabis operators or license holders is defined locally. So the definition in Los Angeles will be divergent from the definition in Mendocino, will be divergent from San Francisco. And so each of these has regional differences in how they define that. There are in San Francisco, you've got to qualify for, say, 4 out of 7 criteria, but it doesn't matter which one it is. In Mendocino, if you've been the victim of sexual servitude or certain other things, you can qualify with that, but that's not a criteria in San Francisco. And so there is no
gotcha.
one homogenized, congruent definition of social equity. And in some ways, I think that that's very healthy and makes sense because at least in California, this notion of local control was baked into at least legalizing adult use, right? The other part of it is race, right? I look in my Zoom, I see a man that doesn't look white, I see your last name, I'm going to take a stab and say that you may be Asian, right? And so there's this conversation about race. But when we look at the missteps and the successes of public policy, which is what I studied in college, I look at affirmative action and the way in which affirmative action in many places was rolled back because it was considered race-based criteria. And because of that, it didn't stand the test of pushback judicially from stakeholders who argued that, hey, that's not fair because it's race-based. So
Right.
when it came to social equity, instead of defining things in terms of race, although we know that prohibition disproportionately impacted communities that were not white, we look instead to have disproportionately impacted areas. And so by making it geography-based instead of race-based, the idea is that these policies will stand the test of sort of pushback judicially or through, civil litigation. And then we can say, look, this neighborhood, separate from what you look like on the outside, this neighborhood was clearly an area that was more enforced compared with this area, right? Like we know that, East Palo Alto certainly saw more cannabis enforcement than probably Atherton, right? And a lot of that is economics, but a lot of it is also, what the communities in those areas look like. So
Does that also apply to uh, minority-owned businesses as well?
Well, so because of that, social equity typically is not defined in terms of race. And when it is, there's this conversation between stakeholders and policymakers about, hey, if you define it as race-based, will that withstand scrutiny and will those programs be able to stay in place?
Right.
And so we have seen places where race is a consideration in social equity. And we've also seen places where we said, hey, let's learn from well-intended legislation in the past and where making a race-based criteria might make that policy more subject to dilution, termination, or revision later on. So the next thing you asked about is standing up a nursery. So you've got these local definitions of social equity, and Mr. Hayashi may or may not qualify depending on where that nursery permit is submitted, whether it's in Long Beach, Los Angeles, Oakland, Mendocino. All of those are going to, each area is going to come into play. The second thing is you have to be what's called a qualified social equity applicant or verified social equity applicant typically in those jurisdictions or municipalities before you apply for the permit. So it's not the kind of thing that I've seen a lot of retroactive, oh, here you go,
Right.
now you're social equity. And one of the reasons for that is because typically one of the benefits of social equity is permit priority, meaning they're jump to the front of the line or your
Hmm.
permit is processed faster. Now, to the nursery permit, because social equity was almost a bolt-on, an afterthought, there are continued conversations about how to support and prioritize social equity. Some of that is through the grant funding once they've been issued a local license. Some of that is through technical assistance and operational guidance to third-party service providers. And another way is through fee waivers or reductions to the onerous tax structure that has been foisted upon the entire cannabis industry, especially in California. So to your point, fee waivers. So fee waivers, both locally and at a state level, are a great way for these programs to put their money where their mouth is and to prioritize social equity operators by saying, look, you already got taxed on a variety of levels over a long period of time. And so because of that, we're going to give you some tax relief now. Frankly, I think that it opens up this broader conversation about whether the tax structure that is currently in place locally and at the state level is really inclusive and is going to bring in legacy stakeholders. And I think that a lot of social equity applicants who qualify come from regions and communities that do have a higher percentage of legacy stakeholders. And so I think that, we can look back on the last couple of years of taxes and say that clearly that has not brought as many people to the regulated table as possible, and that probably lowering taxes and increasing participation in regulated cannabis is the best way to grow those tax revenues.
As you know, as this the forward movement of cannabis is being recognized through various states, and my presumption is that one, it will be federally regulated within the next 18-24 months. Do you see social equity going across every single state, or do you think it's just going to be pickpocketed through different states, that program itself?
So they say that too much agreement kills a good conversation. So allow me to disagree with you.
Sure.
I don't think we have an 18 to 24 month federal legalization window. I think that for the most part in the industry, people have been saying that there'll be federal legalization in 3 to 5 years for far more than 3 to 5 years. And that talking point has remained the same, even though the time has continued and has proven that that talking point either needs to be revisited or just isn't accurate. Now, you said 18, 24 months, which is less than 3 to 5 years. We've seen substantial multinationals such as Canopy Growth and whatnot place bets on federal legalization. And it's a great bet at best. We've even seen companies like Flowcana, who sort of had an initial business model around this idea that California sun-grown cannabis was going to eventually be available outside of California. And currently, with the dumpster fire that is some of California's cannabis ecosystem, and that's not playing out. So I don't think it gets done in 18 to 24 months, but just as importantly, even if it gets done, I think you've got another 18 months in figuring out how it actually gets implemented as policy, separate from whether those federal restrictions and prohibitions are removed. Now, here's the next thing. We've got these two arguments, two camps in terms of societal change. One is incrementalism, and one is let's get it right the first time. And we saw a lot of the social equity conversation using safe banking as sort of a springboard to have this conversation about incrementalism, or do we get it done the first time correctly or as adequately as we'd like to actually see these policies, play out. And so with safe banking, not only did it not get passed, but there was this conversation, I think, within the diversity, inclusion, and social equity community about whether the iteration that was being suggested to be passed did enough and went far enough and prioritized social equity well enough. And so I think that there will be different perspectives for stakeholders within regulated cannabis about whether we need to run at and get federal legalization done as quickly as possible because it's still this major issue, or whether we need to make sure it gets done right. And in getting done right, Does it prioritize social equity? Because for the most part, social equity has been and by the way, like an asterisk to cannabis policy, not something that was necessarily built in. And so I think that
Gotcha.
you will find that there'll be two different camps. One that says, look, federal legalization is long overdue and let's just get it done, continue to improve and iterate on it. And
Right.
another camp that says federal legalization without prioritizing social equity is a bastardization and poor policy. And so to your question, will there be sort of a patchwork of social equity definitions or a singular federal definition? I think the answer might be both, right? I think that there may be a basic social equity sort of criteria that can apply. And I think that they will likely defer to the states and potentially even to counties and cities who may want to make their programs more robust, more restrictive, or more detailed in what those definitions look like. And I think that there needs to be some flexibility in that, only in so much as I believe truly that the agrarian definition of social equity and the urban definition of social equity may look very different. And those qualifying criteria probably need to be different based just on the fact that there
Right.
is no ghetto in the forest.
Right. What kind of advice do you have to people who still want to get into the cannabis space as a business? What would be one of your first, words of wisdom?
I believe regulated cannabis is like Ocean's 11. I think you need a team. I think you need your safe cracker, your getaway driver, your check writer, your master plans person. I think I'm not doing a good job of explaining why I think it's like Ocean's 11. It's like, yeah, there's the little guy who can fit in the little cart. There's the person who puts on the mask and the costume and diverts the guards. So I believe it's team first, play second. And what I see is a lot of people do the opposite. They get an idea, they think they know what they want to do, and then they try to build a team around it. I think it's far better to build the team and let the collective wisdom and experience of the team inform what that play is going to be. So the first thing I would say is build a team, okay? And build a team of divergent skill sets and divergent opinions. If all you do is grab a bunch of yes men and yes women, that's not going to work. The other thing I think is really important about building a team is what we've seen over the period of regulated cannabis is that diversity, especially at the top level of cannabis businesses, has gone down. Less color, less women. So we keep seeing women's conferences in cannabis, and the more people talk about it, the less it's actually there. So I think we've reached this sort of weird place of like there's this inversely proportional relationship between discussing the issues versus change, actual change. So I think build a team, make sure the team is diverse, both in terms of, skill sets, experience, but also put some women, put some people of color. Let's make sure that there's a mosaic, right? That's also really important because you have to think about your customer is most likely far more diverse than your board of directors. And that's not a good look, especially when all good companies serve the end user, the consumer, the patient, right? So I think it's team first. And then I think it's play second. And then the third thing is, and this is, I think, critical, is cannabis, for the most part, unless you're talking about intellectual property or branding, cannabis is at its heart real estate first. It is real estate first. There is not a permit that I'm aware of, at least in California and many of the other states, where your permit can travel. Most permits are APN or address specific. So it's really, really important to start with real estate. You don't have to buy it. You don't even necessarily have to lease it, but you have to find a way to control or have the option to control that real estate, because in the absence of that real estate, you got nothing. You got a Canva deck page that looks cool with a few people's pictures and some LinkedIn hyperlinks, and that's not a business. So I think it's team first, play second, real estate, and then the very next thing to me in terms of the order of operations to create efficiency and not we learned a lot, is money, right? Teams with capital can make mistakes and learn to fight better, learn to live learn to fight a better day. They can make these mistakes and still be left standing, right? Because this is a business of attrition. Teams that are lean and mean, it's great to be lean and mean, but if your resources are so thin that one mistake puts a company out of business, where are they now, then you were undercapitalized. And so I think that we see typically two opposite ends of the spectrum: overcapitalized, bloated, stupid companies making stupid purchase decisions and blowing other people's money and maybe not being totally fiduciary, or lean and mean, hyper efficient companies that are amazing at what they do, but they make one or two mistakes and they're done. So I think that getting that capital in place right out of the gate, remember, it's team, play, real estate, capital. To me, that's the sequence of events. And when people do it in that way, they avoid a lot of the lessons learned, a lot of the, well, we could have, should have, would have. And it's just, to me, it's a recipe. And when people follow a recipe, they're going to have predictable results with that recipe. The variables that I think are beyond people's control should ideally, the majority of them should be external to the entity and external to the opportunity that the entity is designed to run at. And those are going to be frequent, and some are going to be surprises, but at least internally, I think people really need to be buttoned up. And I think when it comes to a team, the three most important things on a team, and I say this all the time, and it's really only three things: scope, comp, and timeline. What do they do? What do they get for it? And when does it need to be done by?
And on that note, that's great, Yarrow. Thank you so much. This is, we should do this again. I think a lot of people out there are going to have a lot of questions and you're going to have a lot of answers to these questions. So, we should continue on doing this. And as more questions come up, and if you have any questions, go ahead and drop it on the comment section or email us info@cannabis-clearwater.com. We will forward those questions to Yarrow. Yarrow, why don't you give a quick contact, your shout out to anyone who wants to contact you personally?
Yeah, I mean, look, I've got a new website under construction and with a teeny little email address. Don't bother with that. I've got a Gmail. Don't bother with that. I live on LinkedIn. Okay, that's Facebook and Instagram for guys my age.
We'll send out the
really
LinkedIn
one of the only cannabis friendly forums, right? In Instagram, people are getting their accounts set down. LinkedIn to me is the most cannabis friendly business channel. So I'm on LinkedIn. I'm Yarrow Kubrin at LinkedIn, and I maybe spend a little too much time there, but I've gotten a lot of great results. So I support people thinking of LinkedIn as part of the way that they navigate the regulated cannabis ecosystem.
Awesome, man. Well, thank you so much. I really do appreciate it. And I'll talk to you soon.
Thanks, Matt.